Ghost stories and unexplained phenomena are shrouded in mystery. Their very nature removes them from the field of exact science. Welcome. Today we will explore some more stories and folklore that has us question what lies at the edges of our understanding of reality. Together, we'll see just what lurks in the dark and forgotten corners of Kentucky. Hello, and welcome back to Folklore Feature. Today we'll be looking at a couple more stories from the book Tragedy at Devil's Hollow. We've got a couple of ghost stories today, so I hope that's interesting for everybody. Thank you for joining me, and we're going to dive right into it today. Ghost at the Well. The following story was told to me several years ago by an old mountaineer. The farmhouse where the events took place is a perfect setting for a ghost sighting. The old, deserted house is falling down. It sits forlornly in a weed-choked yard, surrounded by ancient trees which cast shadows in the moonlight. Shadows that resemble hands reaching out as if trying to stop some terrible deed, and a sagging fence whose gate long ago gave up the struggle to hang straight. It is a quiet, lonely place. The story began in 1921, when James Adair, his wife, and two small children, aged 6 and 4, moved to southeastern Pike County, Kentucky. Adair was a quiet, hard-working man who spent most of each week away from home on his job. His wife, Velma, was just the opposite. She loved to dance and to visit neighbors. She usually spent more time socializing than she did caring for her family. It wasn't long before two of the local young men began to take advantage of Adair's absence to visit Velma on one pretense or another. At first, no gossip was attached to the attention being paid to the young wife and mother, but when the visits of the two men began to be every night when Adair wasn't home, rumors started to circulate in the hill country. As usually happens, someone dropped a word to Adair during one of his weekends at home. Most people thought this would be the end of it. Adair would talk to his wife and put a stop to the visits, but he appeared to ignore the gossip. Adair took several days off from his job so he and a few neighbors could start digging a well in his backyard. When the shaft was down to 40 feet, they struck water, which filled the well to a depth of about 20 feet. A few days later, Adair's nearest neighbors were summoned by his small son. They rushed to the house and found Adair on his knees looking into the well, where his wife's body was floating. He later explained that he had not had time to build a cover for the well opening. He had been tired and had gone to bed early the night before and went straight to sleep. He had not missed his wife until morning. She must have gone outside during the night, he said, and in the dark accidentally stumbled into the well and drowned. There was no reason to disbelieve Adair's story. Several of the men present had helped him dig the well. They understood that with all the other work Adair had to do, he simply had not had time to build the covering. The large gash on Velma's head was believed to have been made by the rock wall of the well. No autopsy was performed. The coroner returned a verdict of death by accident. One thing did seem strange, though. A gold locket and chain, Velma's most prized piece of jewelry, which she was never known to remove from her neck, was missing. But those things get lost. It was probably at the bottom of the well. It could have broken when she fell. Adair could not remember when he had last seen her wearing it. A few months later, after Adair and his children had moved away, those who passed the deserted house at night reported seeing a ghost. A pale figure of a woman was seen walking in the yard, then disappearing into the well. Screams would be heard, as if from a great distance. After a few such sightings, several people in the little community began to recall various strange things that had happened after Velma's death. Adair had been extremely nervous and insisted on burying his wife immediately after the inquest. He would let no one talk to his children. Less than a week after his wife's funeral, Adar sold almost everything he owned and moved away, telling no one where he was going. Several weeks after Velma's funeral, a blood-spotted crowbar and a gold locket and chain, exactly like Velma's, were found by a road crew working less than a mile from Adar's house. The two young men who had visited Velma so frequently left the neighborhood suddenly. They joined the army, their families explained. The hill people wondered about these things, and now suspected that Adar had killed his wife. But since Velma had no relatives to press further investigation, and since there was no real proof, nothing more was done. Though the mysterious death of Velma Adar occurred over 60 years ago, there are those who have visited the deserted farmhouse recently. Even now, they say, when the moon is full and the winds are chasing clouds across the sky, when the air is brisk with autumn, the pale, misty outline of a woman who is dressed in a long white nightgown and who has a terrible wound on her head can be seen in the half shadows cast by the ancient trees that surround the old dwelling. The apparition holds its throat and walks round the yard, looking down, as if searching. After a few seconds, it drifts slowly along the ground to the old well, where it disappears. Then, the screams are heard, screams which gradually fade into silence. Author's note: strangely, the apparition has never been seen to come out of the well. It just appears suddenly in the yard, and the screams are not heard until it disappears. This phenomenon has been witnessed many times by many different people during the last 60 years. I personally visited the farm at night and saw the house and partially filled well. For those that are faint of heart, the old deserting farmhouse is no place to be during the witching hour. Since most ghost stories are shrouded in mystery and do not have to be proved, one view is as accurate as the other. But one thing is certain: there are more mysteries than known facts. There will always be something to keep us puzzled. Okay, another pretty classic ghost story, a little bit spooky. Very interestingly, this doesn't seem to be a story of a vengeful spirit, just a shade of somebody looking for something they're missing, perhaps keeping her from moving on to the afterlife. I like this one. It's a good one. I like the writing. Good atmosphere. Not really a ton of plot holes or anything. Yeah, just a good solid one. I hope you enjoyed it. We're gonna move right along to our next story. Callahan and the Phantom Horse. Relatives of Dennis Callahan still tell the story of his terrible death in 1930. A few older members of that eastern Kentucky family still recall the frightening, unexplainable details of the event. Callahan was a man of violent temper. He owned a large farm and worked a great number of farm animals. Without exception, he treated them cruelly. A horse or a mule that didn't perform exactly as Callahan expected was savagely beaten with a heavy whip which he always carried. He appeared to take special delight in whipping one bay horse in particular. At the slightest provocation, Callahan would whip the bay until blood ran from the cuts. Once a neighbor told him, "Someday you'll pay for the way you treat that animal," but Callahan only laughed. In July 1910, Callahan whipped the horse so badly that it bled to death. Two farm hands who witnessed the beating swore that just before the horse died, they saw hate in the animal's eyes. Hate such as they had never seen from any animal before. The body of the horse was thrown into a sinkhole that was on the farm's property. After 30 years of prosperous farming, Callahan had become financially well off for the times. He sold his farm and bought a house at the edge of a nearby town. In the back of the house was a large field where the man kept several foxhounds. The incident of the bay horse and its bloody death 20 years earlier had long since been put out of his mind. One day, in 1930, Callahan went into the field to check on his hounds. Later, his wife claimed that her first indication that something was wrong was when she heard the excited barking of the dogs. This was soon followed by the frantic screams from her husband. He was shouting, "For God's sakes, somebody get this horse away from me!" Mrs. Callahan ran to the edge of the field where she could see her husband running in circles. He was dodging and running as if to avoid an attacker that Mrs. Callahan could not see. Each time Dennis Callahan stumbled and fell, she could see his clothing sink as if from an invisible blow. Each time the mysterious force struck him, blood spurted from the wound it made. Above the commotion of her husband's screams and the bark of the dogs, Mrs. Callahan claimed she could hear the shrill whinny of a horse and the sound of stomping horse hooves. The noise had drawn several neighbors to the field. They too could hear the sounds of an enraged horse, but could not see one. After several minutes, Callahan lay motionless in a trampled and bloody mass. At this point, the sounds of the horse stopped, as if the invisible avenger realized that its antagonist was dead. Mrs. Callahan and her neighbors watched as the doctor and county coroner examined the dead man. They found that most every bone in Callahan's body had been broken. On his body they found numerous imprints of a horseshoe, although not one hoofprint could be found on the ground. There was no evidence of trampled grass or broken shrubbery that might have been caused by a horse. There was nothing to indicate that a horse had ever been in the field. The autopsy performed on Callahan's body turned up a most unusual finding. Mixed with the human blood was the blood of a horse. Impossible? There are persons still alive today who can remember the day that Dennis Callahan was trampled to death by an invisible horse. They will swear that the event took place just the way it has been related. Is it possible that the bay horse Callahan had beaten to death 20 years before somehow came back to wreak this terrible revenge on the man who killed him? And now we have a story of a most definitely a vengeful spirit. Our first animal ghost, I guess, a horse ghost. This one's pretty interesting. This one is more satisfying than the first one, because you see the villain, if you will, get his in the end. This was an interesting one. I looked into this a little bit more because it was 1930. Thought maybe I could look into like the records of a Callahan dying, and obviously I didn't find anything, but it was still fun to research and try to find. So far, none of the stories I've read that I've looked into have had any actual proof in them, but that's it. It's still fun. I mean, if we were reading these to find proof of it or to try to prove it as right, that'd just be foolish now, wouldn't it? This is for enjoyment. So I know a little shorter with the two stories today, but I got a little bit of a throat bug going around, so my voice might be a little different. So that's fine by me. I'll probably be back with another one. Oh, who knows, a week or so. I work full time, so. But yes, thank you for listening if you've listened to my ramble so far, and this is Hopeful American, signing out.